You probably don't remember where you were the last time gas prices broke you, but your body does. There's something that happens when you pull into a station and the number on that sign doesn't make sense. It's not just money, it's something older than that, a quiet panic. The feeling that something, somewhere, slipped out of control and nobody told you it was going to happen. It happened in 1973. It happened in 1979. It happened in 2008. And every single time, the people in charge said the same thing afterward. We didn't see it coming. They were lying. Or they were asleep. Either way, you paid for it. Here's what I want you to sit with for the next few minutes. The conditions that created every major oil shock in modern history. The scarcity, the dependency, the geopolitical fragility are not behind us. They've been rearranged, quietly. And the system that's supposed to protect America from the next one has been slowly hollowed out, piece by piece, while everyone was looking somewhere else. This isn't a prediction, it's a pattern. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's start with something most people get wrong. When Americans think about oil dependency, they think about the Middle East. They picture sheikhs and sand and tankers moving slow through the Persian Gulf. And there's a reason for that. It's the image that was burned into the national consciousness in 1973, when Arab members of OPEC turned off the tap, and the United States learned, in the most humiliating way possible, that it had built an entire civilization on an assumption. The assumption was simple: cheap energy would always be there, and for a long time it was. American industry ran on it. The suburbs were designed around it. The interstate highway system, the trucking network, the agricultural supply chain, all of it was engineered with one quiet variable baked in: that oil would be cheap, that oil would be available, that nothing would ever seriously interrupt the flow. Then, October 1973 arrived, and within weeks, gas lines stretched around city blocks. Factories cut production. The Dow lost 45% of its value. Inflation spiked in ways that took a decade to tame. And the United States, the most powerful economy in the history of the world, was brought to its knees by a supply disruption it had seen coming and chosen to ignore. But here's the part that gets buried in the history books. The 1973 shock wasn't really about oil. Not fundamentally. It was about the gap between what America consumed and what America controlled. That gap had been growing for years. Domestic production had peaked in 1970, a fact that a geologist named M. King Hubbert had predicted with uncomfortable precision 15 years earlier, and that the industry had spent considerable energy dismissing. By the time the embargo hit, the United States was importing roughly a third of its oil. Vulnerable in ways its leaders hadn't fully acknowledged publicly. What happened next is the part that matters for what we're talking about today. Rather than restructuring, rather than making the hard decisions about consumption, urban design, industrial planning, America chose a different path. It found new suppliers. It built the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It invested in North Sea access and Alaskan pipelines. It negotiated security arrangements with Gulf monarchies that traded military protection for stable supply. And eventually, the crisis faded. Prices came down, the lines disappeared, and the country exhaled and went back to what it had always done. It didn't solve the problem, it postponed it. And postponement, in geopolitics, always comes with interest. Because what America built between 1974 and today wasn't energy independence. Not really. What it built was a more sophisticated, more globally distributed, more institutionally embedded version of the same dependency. The names changed, the shipping lanes shifted, the financial instruments grew more complex, but the core equation, an economy structurally reliant on a continuous, affordable supply of oil it does not fully control, never changed. The shale revolution felt like the answer. For a moment, around 2018, the United States became the largest oil producer in the world. Politicians declared victory. Energy independence, finally, after half a century of trying. And there was truth in it. American production had genuinely transformed the global supply picture. The leverage OPEC once held had been diluted. That was real. But production volume and strategic independence are not the same thing. Because the shale industry runs on capital. It runs on a financial model that requires continuous investment, continuous drilling, continuous debt servicing, just to maintain output. It's not like a conventional oil field that produces steadily for decades. Shale wells decline fast. Production drops sharply in the second and third year. You have to keep drilling just to stay still. And that means the industry is acutely sensitive to price. When oil drops below a certain threshold, the economics collapse. Rigs get stacked, workers go home, production falls. Which means the one thing America built its energy confidence on in the last decade is, by design, fragile. Not weak, not broken, fragile. There's a difference. It works beautifully under normal conditions. It bends badly under stress. And stress, in the global oil market, is never far away.
There's a map that energy analysts look at when they want to understand where the world's oil actually moves. It's not a political map. It doesn't show countries or borders in the way you'd recognize. It shows choke points, the narrow passages, the straits, the canals, the corridors where the global supply chain compresses itself into something terrifyingly thin. And when you look at that map long enough, you start to understand something that no energy policy speech will ever tell you directly. The global oil system is not a network. It's a thread. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 21 miles. And through that gap moves approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply, every day. The Arabian Gulf empties through it. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Iran, all of it funnels through that corridor before it reaches the tankers that carry it to Asia, to Europe, to everywhere that needs it. 21 miles. There are places in the American Midwest wider than that. Now consider what sits on either side of that strait. On one side, some of the wealthiest and most politically volatile monarchies in the world. Governments whose internal stability is, to put it diplomatically, not guaranteed in perpetuity. On the other side, Iran, a country that has spent decades developing the military capability, the asymmetric doctrine, and the stated willingness to use both, specifically to threaten that corridor. Iranian naval exercises in the Gulf aren't theatre. They're a message, delivered repeatedly to anyone paying attention. And the message is, we can close this. Not permanently, but long enough. Long enough is all it takes. Because the global oil market doesn't respond to reality. It responds to the anticipation of reality. Prices don't spike when supply is actually cut. They spike when traders believe supply might be cut. When a drone hits a processing facility in Saudi Arabia, as happened in 2019 with the Abqaiq attack, prices jump within hours. The physical supply hadn't changed yet. The molecules were still moving. But the perception of vulnerability had shifted, and that perception alone was enough to reprice the entire global energy market overnight. That's the mechanism. That's what makes the system so brittle. It's not that oil is scarce, it's that confidence in its uninterrupted flow is fragile. And that confidence rests on a set of geopolitical assumptions that have been quietly eroding for the better part of a decade. Think about what's changed since 2015. The Iran nuclear deal was constructed, then abandoned, then partially rebuilt, then strained again. The relationship between Washington and Riyadh, the foundational pillar of Gulf security architecture since the 1970s, has grown complicated in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Yemen became a grinding, multi-year conflict that drew Saudi Arabia into an exhausting war on its southern border. Iraq remains structurally fragile, caught between American influence and Iranian penetration, its oil infrastructure dependent on a political stability that exists mostly on paper. And then there's the broader context. American military presence in the Gulf, the carrier groups, the air bases, the rapid deployment posture that has underwritten regional stability for 50 years, is no longer the unchallenged constant it once was. Not because America has collapsed, but because the strategic calculus in Washington has shifted. There are other theaters now. The Pacific demands attention. Europe demands attention. The Pentagon is being asked to do more with a force structure designed for a different era, in a world where the number of potential flashpoints has multiplied. What that means, in practical terms, is that the implicit guarantee, the guarantee that America would always intervene decisively to keep the Gulf open, carries slightly less weight than it once did. Not zero weight, but less. And in geopolitics, the margin between deterrence and miscalculation is measured in perception, not in hardware. Someone in Tehran understands this. Someone in Moscow understands this. Someone in Beijing has been studying it carefully for years. Because if you wanted to design a scenario that would inflict maximum economic damage on the United States and its allies, without firing a single shot at American soil, you wouldn't attack America directly. That's expensive and unpredictable. You would create, or allow, conditions that disrupted the flow of oil through those 21 miles. You would let the market do the rest. Prices would spike. Inflation would return. Consumer confidence would collapse. Political instability would follow. And the country that thought it had solved its energy problem would discover that it had only rearranged it. The thread is still there. It's just harder to see now.
There's something uncomfortable about the way America talks about energy transition. Not because the transition is wrong, not because renewable energy is a fantasy or a political invention. The wind turbines are real. The solar panels are real. The electric vehicles multiplying on American highways are real. The technology works.
the investment is genuine. And the long arc of it, the slow replacement of fossil fuel dependency with something cleaner and more distributed, that arc is probably real too. The uncomfortable part is the timing, because there is a gap between where the world is today and where the energy transition needs it to be before oil stops mattering strategically. And that gap is not a rounding error. It is not a problem that 5 more years of investment will close. It is a structural chasm that sits at the center of American energy policy, like a fact that nobody in a position of authority wants to say out loud in plain language. The United States today gets roughly 36% of its total energy from petroleum, not electricity, total energy. Transportation, manufacturing, petrochemicals, agriculture. The systems that move food from farms to tables, that keep hospital generators running, that underpin the logistics network that delivers everything to everywhere. Those systems run on oil, not on intention, not on targets, on oil. And the speed at which that changes is not determined by policy ambition. It's determined by physics, capital, and infrastructure replacement cycles that operate on timelines measured in decades, not election cycles. Consider transportation alone. There are roughly 280 million registered vehicles in the United States. The average age of an American car is 12 years. The transition to electric vehicles, even under the most optimistic adoption scenarios, replaces the fleet gradually, over 15, 20, 25 years. In the meantime, those 280 million combustion engines need fuel every day, regardless of what the policy document says, regardless of what the climate target requires. That's not an argument against transition. It's an argument about the window. The window between now and the moment when America's oil dependency drops to a level where a supply disruption becomes manageable rather than catastrophic. That window is open. It will remain open for years, possibly for a decade or more. And what happens inside that window is what this conversation is really about. Because the people who would benefit from an oil shock are not waiting for the window to close. OPEC Plus has spent the last several years demonstrating something that got less attention than it deserved. In 2022, when the Biden administration flew to Saudi Arabia, asking for increased production to relieve pressure on American consumers, Riyadh said no. Then, months later, OPEC Plus announced coordinated cuts. The signal was clear and deliberate. The cartel had reclaimed its pricing power. The shale revolution had disrupted it temporarily, but the discipline had returned, the coordination had held, and the leverage was back. That leverage is not incidental. It is strategic. Saudi Arabia is not a simple petrostate running on inertia. It is a government executing a long-term economic transformation, Vision 2030, that requires sustained oil revenues at a price floor high enough to fund the diversification away from oil itself. The irony is layered. To transition beyond oil dependency, Saudi Arabia needs oil prices to stay high long enough to pay for the transition. And the tool it uses to maintain that price floor is the same tool it has always used: supply management. Russia's calculus is different but compatible. Since the invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent sanctions regime, Moscow has become more dependent on oil revenues than ever, and more motivated to see prices elevated. The relationship between Moscow and Riyadh inside OPEC Plus is not a friendship. It is a marriage of convenience between two governments that disagree on almost everything, except one thing: that lower oil prices serve American interests and higher oil prices serve theirs. That alignment doesn't need to be coordinated in a room, it just needs to persist. And then there's China, which is the piece of this that tends to get lost in the American conversation, because China is usually framed as an economic competitor or a diplomatic adversary, not as an actor with a direct interest in the structure of the global oil market. But China is now the world's largest oil importer. It has spent 15 years building relationships, infrastructure, and financial architecture across the Gulf, across Africa, across Central Asia, precisely to secure supply chains that bypass the dollar-denominated system that America sits at the center of. The Belt and Road Initiative is, among other things, an energy security project. The Petro-Yuan agreements, the slow, patient effort to price some oil transactions in Chinese currency rather than dollars, are an energy security project. The deepening relationships with Iran, with Venezuela, with Russia, all of it connects back to the same strategic objective. China is not trying to cause an oil shock. It's trying to make sure that when one comes, it is insulated from the consequences in ways that America is not. That asymmetry, that difference in exposure, is the real danger. Not a sudden dramatic attack on a pipeline, not a war in the Gulf that closes the strait overnight. The real danger is a slow, structural shift in who bears the cost of energy volatility. And right now, that shift is moving in one direction, away from Beijing, toward Washington. There's a number that doesn't get talked about enough in Washington: 727 million barrels. That's the capacity of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPR. The underground salt caverns along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana, where America stores its emergency oil supply. It was built after 1973 specifically for moments like the one we're describing. A buffer, an insurance policy, the physical embodiment of the lesson learned from that first shock. Here's the problem. As of early 2024, the reserve sat at roughly 360 million barrels, less than half its capacity, the lowest level in 40 years. Between 2021 and 2023, the United States released approximately 270 million barrels from the SPR, the largest drawdown in its history, in an attempt to cool domestic gasoline prices during a period of post-pandemic supply tightness and war-driven market disruption. The releases worked, in a narrow sense. Prices came down, the political pressure eased, the administration called it a success. But the insurance policy had been partially cashed out, and the process of refilling it, which requires buying oil at market prices, injecting it back into the caverns, and doing so at a pace that doesn't itself move the market, is slow, deliberately slow. The Department of Energy has been buying back at a measured rate. Progress is being made, but the gap between where the reserve sits today and where it needs to be to provide meaningful protection against a serious supply disruption remains significant. This matters more than it might seem. The SPR was never designed to replace the market. It was designed to buy time, to give the economy 60, 90, maybe 120 days of breathing room while diplomatic and logistical responses were organized. At full capacity, it could theoretically cover roughly 5 months of net oil imports. At current levels, that cushion is shorter. And in a genuine supply crisis, not a price spike, but an actual physical disruption of the kind that a Hormuz closure or a major Gulf conflict would produce, every day of that buffer matters enormously. But the reserve is only one layer of the problem. The deeper issue is refining capacity. America produces a lot of crude oil. What it doesn't have enough of is the domestic capacity to process certain types of that crude into the refined products, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, that the economy actually runs on. This is a structural quirk that sounds technical, but has real consequences. American shale produces primarily light, sweet crude. But a significant portion of the country's refinery infrastructure was built decades ago to process heavy, sour crude, the kind that comes from Venezuela, from Saudi Arabia, from Mexico. When relations with those suppliers become complicated, when sanctions, diplomacy, or market dynamics reduce the flow of heavy crude, American refiners face a mismatch. They have crude they can't optimally process, or they're missing the crude their refineries were built for. The result is tighter margins, reduced output, and upward pressure on prices for refined products, even when the raw crude supply looks adequate on paper. This is not theoretical. It played out in real time after the Venezuelan sanctions. It played out again, in different form, after the Russian crude export disruptions that followed the Ukraine invasion. Each time, the gap between crude production and refined product availability created its own localized shock, invisible to most people until they saw it at the pump. And there's another layer beneath that. The American energy infrastructure, the pipelines, the terminals, the refineries, the grid interconnections that move energy from where it's produced to where it's consumed, is aging. The average American refinery is over 40 years old. Critical pipeline infrastructure in some regions dates to the 1950s and 1960s. The Colonial Pipeline attack in 2021, a ransomware intrusion that shut down the primary fuel artery serving the East Coast for 6 days, was a demonstration of something the industry had known for years but hadn't fully reckoned with publicly. The physical system is vulnerable in ways that aren't visible until something goes wrong. And here's the thing about infrastructure vulnerability. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly, year by year, deferred maintenance cycle by deferred maintenance cycle, until a single point of failure reveals how much load was resting on how little redundancy. The Colonial attack was a relatively contained event, a ransomware group, not a state actor. 6 days, not 6 months. The East Coast was uncomfortable. It was not broken. But it showed the outline of what broken would look like. Now scale that up. Not a ransomware attack on one pipeline. A genuine supply disruption. Physical, prolonged, geopolitically driven. Combined with a reserve that's been partially depleted, a refinery fleet that's structurally mismatched, and a political environment that has spent years debating energy transition without adequately funding energy resilience. The shock doesn't have to be catastrophic to be consequential. It just has to be large enough and last long enough to outrun the system's ability to absorb it. In 1973, that threshold was crossed in a matter of weeks. The economy wasn't destroyed, but it was bent in ways that took years to straighten. Inflation embedded itself into wage expectations and price-setting behavior and monetary policy in ways that didn't fully resolve until Paul Volcker broke the economy deliberately in the early 1980s to kill it. The hangover from one oil shock lasted a decade. The world today is more financially interconnected than it was in 1973, faster, more leveraged, more dependent on just-in-time supply chains that assume stable input costs. The transmission mechanism from an oil shock to economic pain is not slower than it was 50 years ago. It's faster.
There's a question that sits underneath all of this that nobody in a position of power asks directly. Not in congressional hearings, not in think tank reports, not in the carefully worded energy security strategies that get published and filed and largely ignored. The question is simple, and it's devastating in its simplicity. What happens to the American political system when the next oil shock hits? Not to the economy, not to the markets, to the system itself. Because the 1970s gave us a preview, and the preview was not reassuring. The first oil shock didn't just raise gas prices, it delegitimized a presidency. It fed into a broader unraveling of institutional trust that had been building since Vietnam, since Watergate, since the slow revelation that the people in charge had been making decisions based on assumptions they knew were fragile, and telling the public something different. The lines at the gas stations weren't just an inconvenience, they were a symbol, a visible, daily, humiliating symbol that the social contract, the implicit promise that America's political and economic system would deliver a certain baseline of material stability, had been broken. Jimmy Carter understood this, at least partially. His 1979 speech, the one his advisors called the malaise speech, though he never used that word, was an attempt to tell the truth, to say that America had a deeper problem than energy prices, a crisis of confidence, a gap between what the country believed about itself and what the reality of its situation actually was. The public punished him for it, not because he was wrong, but because telling the truth about systemic vulnerability in a political culture that runs on optimism and forward momentum is almost always electorally fatal. The messenger gets blamed for the message, and the candidate who promises that morning in America is always more electable than the one who asks you to sit with difficult facts. That dynamic hasn't changed. If anything, it's intensified. The American political environment today is more polarized, more reactive, more algorithmically accelerated than anything that existed in 1979. The speed at which economic pain translates into political rage has compressed dramatically. Social media doesn't create discontent, it amplifies it, organizes it, and directs it before the institutions responsible for managing it have had time to formulate a response. Think about what a sustained oil shock would look like in that environment. Gasoline at $6, $7, $8 a gallon. Not for a week, for months. Diesel prices that cascade through the trucking network into food prices, into the cost of everything that moves. Heating oil costs that hit working-class families in the Northeast with the particular brutality of a bill that arrives in winter and cannot be deferred. Airlines cutting routes, supply chains tightening, inflation that the Federal Reserve would face an impossible choice about: raise rates to fight it and risk recession, or hold rates and let it embed. And simultaneously, a political system that would immediately, reflexively, begin assigning blame, not analyzing causes, not debating solutions, assigning blame. That's what the modern political media complex does with economic pain. It converts it into narrative, into villain and victim, into a story that each side of the political divide tells differently, in ways designed to maximize outrage and minimize complexity.
The policy responses available in that environment are not the same as the policy responses available in a calmer one. Emergency SPR releases, temporary fuel subsidies, diplomatic pressure on Gulf producers, all of these become politically coded the moment they're announced. Everything gets filtered through the lens of the culture war that runs as a permanent background process in American political life.
And foreign actors know this. This is perhaps the most underappreciated dimension of energy security in the current era. The strategic value of inducing economic pain in a democracy is not just the pain itself, it's the political fragmentation that follows. A society arguing about who caused the crisis is a society not building the resilience to prevent the next one. A government consumed by the politics of blame is a government not making the hard infrastructure decisions that take decades to pay off. The disruption doesn't have to win on the battlefield. It just has to keep the target distracted long enough. Russia learned something from 2022 that surprised some Western analysts. The economic sanctions, unprecedented in their scale and coordination, damaged the Russian economy significantly, but they didn't collapse it. And part of the reason they didn't collapse it was that elevated energy prices, driven in part by the very disruption Russia had caused, partially offset the sanctions pressure. Moscow hurt, but the pain was manageable, because the cost of the disruption was distributed globally, while the benefit, elevated oil revenues, flowed primarily to the disruptor. That's an asymmetric trade that any rational strategic actor would take, and it establishes a template. Not a conspiracy, not a coordinated master plan executed from a single room, but a template, a demonstrated proof of concept that economic disruption through energy markets can impose significant costs on Western democracies while remaining below the threshold that would trigger a direct military response. The lesson has been observed. It will be applied again. The question is not whether the conditions for another oil shock exist. They do. They have existed in various configurations for decades. The question is whether the accumulation of factors we've been walking through, the depleted reserve, the refinery mismatch, the infrastructure vulnerability, the geopolitical realignment, the political fragility, has raised the probability and the potential severity to a level that should be treated as an urgent strategic priority rather than a background concern. The answer, by any honest reading of the evidence, is yes. And the gap between that answer and the urgency with which it's being addressed in Washington is itself a kind of vulnerability. If you've made it this far with me, I want to pause for just a second, not to summarize, not to review, just to say, if this conversation has meant something to you, if it's made you think differently about something you thought you already understood, consider subscribing to this channel. We do this every week, not to alarm, not to perform outrage, but to look at the world as it actually is, with the seriousness it deserves. That's what Meridian Theory is here for. And if that's something you want more of, the subscribe button costs you nothing. Now, here's what nobody wants to say in the final stretch of this conversation. America has been here before. Not once, not twice, multiple times. And every single time the country reached the edge of the cliff, looked down, felt the vertigo, and then pulled back just enough to avoid the fall. The reserve got built, the pipelines got rerouted, the diplomacy held, the shale fields opened. Something always came through. And that track record is both reassuring and dangerous. It's reassuring for obvious reasons. The system has shown resilience.
The institutions, however imperfect, have produced responses that prevented the worst outcomes. American engineering, American capital, American diplomatic leverage, these are not trivial assets. They've absorbed shocks before, and they may absorb the next one. But the track record is dangerous because it creates a cognitive bias that's almost impossible to see from inside it. The bias of the near miss. Every time you approach a catastrophe and avoid it, your brain updates its model of the world in the wrong direction. It concludes that catastrophe is less likely than it seemed, that the system is more resilient than the evidence warranted, that the people in charge know what they're doing, because look, it worked out. It worked out until it didn't. That's how these things go. The 2008 financial crisis wasn't a surprise to everyone. There were analysts, economists, traders who had been describing the structural fragility of the mortgage market for years. They were ignored, not because the people in charge were stupid, but because the system had survived so many previous warnings that the warnings themselves had lost credibility. The boy who cried wolf. Except the wolf was real. It had always been real. It was just patient. Energy security has its own version of that story playing out right now. The warnings are not new. The IEA has been publishing reports about strategic reserve adequacy for years. Academic papers on Gulf chokepoint vulnerability fill entire journals. The military has war-gamed Hormuz closure scenarios more times than anyone will say publicly. None of this is hidden. None of it is classified. It's just not politically actionable in an environment where the crisis hasn't happened yet, and the cost of prevention is immediate, while the benefit is hypothetical. That's the trap. Prevention is invisible. Crisis is visible. And democratic systems, almost by design, respond to what's visible. So what does preparation actually look like, in practical terms? Because this conversation isn't useful if it ends with a shrug. The SPR needs to be refilled, not gradually, not opportunistically, but deliberately, as a strategic priority, even at cost. The refinery mismatch needs to be addressed through investment in flexible processing capacity that can handle a wider range of crude types. The pipeline and terminal infrastructure needs a security audit and a capital investment cycle that treats it as critical national infrastructure rather than a private sector asset management problem. The diplomatic architecture in the Gulf needs to be rebuilt, not on the assumption that the old relationships will hold indefinitely, but on the recognition that they've changed and that new frameworks need to account for that change. That means engagement with producers that American domestic politics makes uncomfortable. It means conversations that don't fit neatly into the foreign policy narratives that play well in an election year. And the energy transition, which is real and necessary and genuinely important, needs to be sequenced in a way that accounts for the vulnerability window. The goal of reducing oil dependency over 20 years is compatible with the goal of maintaining energy security during the transition, but only if someone is actually managing the gap. Only if the speed of the transition on the demand side is matched by investment in resilience on the supply side. Right now, that coordination doesn't exist at the level it needs to. None of this is impossible. None of it requires technology that doesn't exist or political consensus that has never been achieved. It requires something simpler and rarer. It requires treating a problem that hasn't fully arrived yet as if it matters.
History suggests that's not America's strongest instinct. But history also suggests that when the pressure becomes undeniable, when the crisis makes the abstract concrete and the invisible visible, the country has found ways to respond. The question is always the same question. How much does it have to cost before the response begins?
I want to leave you with something that isn't a statistic. There's a photograph taken in the winter of 1973, a gas station somewhere in the American Midwest. The pumps are wrapped in plastic bags. A handwritten sign on the door says, "No gas today." And in the parking lot, a line of cars stretches back further than the frame can hold. Just waiting. Not moving. Waiting. The people in those cars weren't waiting for gas. They were waiting for someone to tell them that the world they thought they lived in still existed. It did, mostly. The crisis passed. The lines disappeared. The sign came down. And America moved on with the particular speed of a country that has always preferred motion to reflection. That's not a criticism. It's almost a survival mechanism. The ability to absorb a shock and keep moving is part of what makes the American system as durable as it is. But durability and preparedness are not the same thing. A system can survive repeated shocks and still never learn from them. It can absorb the cost, distribute the pain, find the workaround, and emerge on the other side structurally unchanged, ready to be surprised again, ready to rediscover at the worst possible moment the same vulnerabilities it discovered before. That's the cycle. And the cycle turns on something that doesn't show up in energy policy documents or strategic reserve calculations or congressional testimony. It turns on attention, on the willingness of a society, its citizens, its institutions, its leaders, to look at an uncomfortable reality before the reality becomes a crisis. To treat the gap between what we assume and what is actually true as a problem worth solving, while solving it is still relatively cheap. The next oil shock is not inevitable. That needs to be said clearly. The conditions that could produce one exist. The vulnerabilities are real. The geopolitical pressures are real. But history is not destiny. Systems can change. Policies can change. The gap between where the reserve sits today and where it needs to be is a political decision, not a law of physics. The refinery mismatch is an investment problem, not an impossibility. The diplomatic architecture can be rebuilt. None of this is beyond reach. What's beyond reach, historically, is the political will to act on a problem that hasn't fully arrived yet. And that's the thing I want you to carry out of this conversation. Not anxiety. Not the particular helplessness that comes from staring at large systemic problems and feeling small. But something more useful than that. The understanding that the distance between a warning and a crisis is not empty space. It's time. And time, used well, is the most powerful strategic resource there is. The people in those cars in 1973 didn't have the luxury of time. The shock had already arrived. The sign was already on the door. We still have the sign in the back room. Whether it goes up again, and what it costs when it does, depends on decisions being made right now, in policy rooms and budget cycles and diplomatic channels that most people will never see. By people who are, at this moment, choosing between the difficult and the convenient. That choice is always made in the quiet before the crisis, not in the chaos after. If this episode made you see something differently, share it. Not because the algorithm needs it, though it does, but because the people in your life who are paying attention to the world deserve to see this conversation too. Send it to 5 people who think seriously about where things are heading. That's how this kind of work reaches the people it's meant for. And leave a comment. Not a reaction, a thought. Tell me what you think we got wrong, or right, or what question this raised that we didn't answer. And if there's a topic you want us to take on next, a geopolitical system, an economic structure, a historical pattern that you think more people should understand, put it in the comments. That's where the next episode comes from. This is Meridian Theory. We'll see you next time.